So, hello and welcome to one of our conversations with our speakers at Smashing Cons and just generally nice people. You might remember those times when FTP was a big thing, and maybe actually you're still deploying via FTP. That's a perfectly safe space, so you don't have to worry about that. But chances are high that you're not using FTP anymore and instead move to Git-based workflows and probably continuous deployment, all these fancy whistles and bells. And so today I'm very happy to welcome Phil Hawksworth, who is actually working at Netlify developer relationship team. Hello, Phil. How are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you doing, Vitaly? It's nice to see you.
I'm doing great. It's always a pleasure to see you. You're like a sunshine, streaming Netlify and Jamstack and
I
everything.
I try. I'm not even branded up. What a
Yeah,
missed opportunity.
that's
God,
that. That's okay. That's okay. But you have to tell me. So that Jam or Jan or Jeet, like Jam, is it Jam?
jam. It's
Jam.
jam. It's all
Okay,
about the jam.
it's all Jam. So the Jamstack for developers or designers who actually never heard the term before. If you wanted to maybe sum up like what it is and why it's good and what are the benefits of it in the first place, and why would you ever want to move from your traditional good old stack to Jamstack? Maybe you could sum it up briefly.
Oh, let me see if I can try. Because it's tempting just to say, well, Jamstack, the JAM in that stands for JavaScript APIs and markup. But that in itself doesn't really explain very much, just knowing what it stands for. So really, Jamstack is all about a way of deploying and serving websites that don't rely on an origin server. They don't rely on requests hitting an active server all the time. So you might be more familiar with stacks like the LAMP stack, which was Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. That was the kind of stack that was serving your site there. With Jamstack, it's a bit different because we've kind of moved up a level away from the server and closer to the browser. So it's thinking a lot about getting into a browser as fast as possible and then using technologies in the browser to enhance it and augment it later on. So Jamstack is all about pre-rendering sites, getting it into the browser, and then maybe enhancing it, augmenting it, the experience with JavaScript running in your browser, maybe making requests to APIs and that kind of thing. So that's the model, trying to get away from having a server that you need to maintain. Because I know maintaining a server is difficult. I don't know about you, but I've got lots of sites that kind of went away when I just turned my back on them for a few years. I needed to upgrade PHP,
Mm.
which meant I needed to upgrade the version of Linux, which I've done once in a blue moon. So, maintaining servers is difficult. So the idea of the Jamstack is to try and make it as simple as possible to serve sites as static assets and then make the most of all of the APIs and the capabilities in the browser to do kind of augmentation and do more things with them there.
Right, makes sense. Well, in fact, of course, we moved to Jamstack, what now, 2 years ago or so now?
2 years,
Yeah,
yeah.
that feels like it was quite a journey for us. And of course, we learned a few lessons along the way. But I'm wondering, would you say that essentially every project could benefit somehow from moving some parts of it to Jamstack? Or like, where do you see its limitations? Is it something that potentially every developer could use in a project, or is it something that's kind of dedicated to a particular group of websites or group of projects?
Yeah, I mean, it's tempting to say, oh yeah, you can use it for everything. Um, but I think you should be careful saying that about any technology. You really need to kind of pick the use cases and make sure it's tailored well. I would say that, the first instinct when you think about a Jamstack site and maybe think about something which is served as static assets, maybe directly from a CDN, you might think, well, that's only really good for sites which don't change very often. They're quote unquote static, they don't change. But in actual fact, that's not really the case because so many tools exist now that can reduce the friction in deploying things that you can deploy many, many times a day or many times an hour if you want, and actually make things feel a lot more dynamic than they might have done before. So some of those kind of use cases where you think, well, they wouldn't be appropriate, those actually come into the fold as well. The time that it gets challenging, perhaps, though, is when we're creating sites that have many, many pages, many hundreds of thousands or many millions of pages, because the Jamstack model really makes a lot of sense when you can pre-generate your site. So you might be using a static site generator. Those are really kind of in vogue at the moment. Those are really, really popular. But of course, they have to do a piece of work every time they deploy an update. So if you have a site, maybe like a newspaper site that has many millions of pages, the work that's required to regenerate that can be quite, that can take a long time. So that's when you start bumping into some of the limitations of where Jamstack can be kind of simply used. You can start to get a bit crafty and start to work around that if you're very, very crafty, but it definitely introduces some challenges. One of the things I'm starting to see from a variety of different static site generators, like Gatsby, for instance, or React Static, and also Hugo, is the teams behind those static site generators are starting to explore ways that you can do kind of progressive generation of the pages. So in other words, you don't redeploy the entire site or regenerate the entire site every time something changes, but try and find ways to do incremental builds. It's kind of a challenging problem to overcome, but there's work being done on that at the moment. So that will help to try and break down that barrier as well. But certainly at the moment, finding ways to use a Jamstack site for a website that has many millions of pages or many hundreds of thousands of pages, that's where it can be a little bit challenging right now.
Oh, that's interesting. So actually the idea being then to serve a diff of the state that you have, and essentially whatever you have to build, like a new part that has to be kind of patched into it. It's very interesting to see this happening because you also, just recently, I think 2 weeks ago, there was an article by Jason Parmental coming up where the idea was actually very similar, where you would actually load web fonts, and then you load the first patch that you need, and then you load the second, and then you actually merge them in a way to create a new font, like also incremental font loading. So that would be really interesting to explore that.
Yeah, and it's not just so much of the loading; it's the generation
of the build out. Yeah,
yeah,
of course.
exactly.
I understand. But what do you think are kind of the common challenges that most developers have? I mean, maybe let me kind of move back first. If you've never worked on Jamstack before and you are very much comfortable and happy with your LAMP stack, and you wanted maybe to explore the possibilities and advantages like, security and performance of Jamstack, how would you actually start? Where would you move? And what does it mean in terms of the workflow change?
So, I mean, the changes to the workflow can actually be quite profound because you're taking away a lot of the infrastructure that you'd normally depend on and saying, actually, we can do away with that and start deploying things directly to a CDN. But in terms of how someone might get started experimenting with this, chances are they might be using some of the aspects of this already. Even on kind of traditional ways of building things for the web, if you think about how you might build something on the LAMP stack, chances are, in your PHP there, you're doing things like, writing a template that grabs data from a data source, in this case, the MySQL database or some kind of database, rendering those things into a view and then getting them served. And that's kind of similar to how static site generators work. They have templates, they grab data from somewhere. That might be kind of structured data in files, or it might be hitting some kind of database or a content API. But either way, it's grabbing data, combining that data with templates, generating views. And the only difference is that it's not doing that on demand, it's doing that ahead of time. So some of the logical steps and the kind of cognitive steps for a developer might not actually be that huge. The biggest change is in thinking about how you deploy things, because really what you're deploying is your built, rendered assets in entirety every time you want to do a deployment. That starts to bring things like the management of the content and the management of the code all into the same place, so that things like the version control are across all of those things together. So that starts to be a slightly different way of thinking about how you might kind of develop and manage a site and the content within it. So there are a few little kind of changes there. But the nice thing is that a lot of static site generators can be quite straightforward to start experimenting with. And the nice thing is you don't need a ton of infrastructure to do this. So the nice thing is that you can really start to build things out right on your local machine. You're running a static site generator right on your machine, and you can get a really good sense of what the outcome is going to be without needing to lean on lots of other infrastructure. So that kind of first step, the on-ramp, can be quite shallow for you to start to say, well, I'll try this particular set of tools, I can run them locally, and you'll have good confidence that then when you deploy the output of that somewhere, that'll be exactly the same where you deploy it as it would be locally. That's one of the things I love about rendering things that are static, because you're not depending on lots of infrastructure and moving parts to serve them. you can look at them on a static server on your own machine and think, yeah, this is how it'll work when it goes off to a CDN.
And also in terms of infrastructure, when we look, for example, into the way we build single-page applications, and there is a huge, number of options of what you could do, like fully
Yeah,
server, fully client, and everything in between.
yeah,
So I think in our case, because we are kind of building out a skeleton and we're serving it straight to the CDN with the content and all, and then we're kind of enhancing with JavaScript. It was actually quite reasonable and quite, I wouldn't say it was easy, but it made sense to move to that kind of setup because in the
hmm
end, it's just content that lives, on the page. It's just, HTML with a
right.
few, comments area and search box and, a
hmm
few other things. But if you're moving towards like really, let's say, standalone application, maybe even, I don't know, financial application,
hmm
online banking, this kind of thing, do you think still that Jamstack would be a good option to consider there? Or if you're having something like it requires a lot of logic, right? Should it all live kind of, does it need a server or not? I'm trying to push you in the corner here.
Yeah, well, I hate to trot out that old phrase, it depends, but it kind of does depend a little bit. That said, there are lots of applications which work just as well being a JavaScript application as actually having a server-side component to them. Now, I say that with a certain amount of caution because, I'm a little bit old school when it comes to web development, and I really like getting things into the browser as HTML as much as possible, and then having a really high kind of uh, like watermark from where you progressively enhance from. So I don't personally like doing everything in JavaScript and just like shipping an empty body tag and then running everything through JavaScript. That said, there are some times where that's perfectly acceptable. If you're thinking about a certain kind of application, which of course would heavily depend on JavaScript, and you know your audience, that can be completely reasonable. I mean, there are things that have shipped recently. I'm thinking actually of something that shipped at Google I/O for, as an example, the Chrome team put together a game which was very heavily JavaScript, and that worked beautifully, kind of served statically. So that there are plenty of use cases where that can work.
Okay.
But kind of going back to your financial example, I used to work. My very first job actually was putting numbers on screens for traders to trade off using web technologies. And this was before WebSockets. It was before Ajax. It's before anything really that was useful to help you do that. And it's kind of challenging. But more recently, you would do a lot of that kind of thing in JavaScript. And that makes perfect sense. You can start to make secure requests to APIs right from the browser. There's plenty of models now for doing authentication and authorization directly from your browser. So in many ways, this can simplify the stack for financial institutions that want to build some of these things out, because the way that they can decouple some of these things can make them much more manageable. So I'd certainly think that the Jamstack kind of model can perfectly work in that scenario as well.
Okay. So maybe coming back now to just to explore that world of Jamstack and frontend. What are you most excited about these days, Phil? Like if you look at like Jamstack or like frontend in general, is there something that really keeps you awake at night, where you wake up in in the morning hoping that yes, I'm going to work on that someday. One day I will get it done. Do you have something of
Well,
that kind?
yeah, and to be honest, this is the kind of thing where your answer could be different day by day because it feels like this world moves so quickly. And that in itself is one of the things that excites me so much. Now that we're starting to see, really the browser APIs start to really progress and the kind of things that we can do directly in the browser without having to implement them ourselves. That's kind of exciting to me. I'm still very much a duffer when it comes to SVGs. I should explain the word duffer. If anyone who's not English and watching this, it means a fool. It means I'm way behind the curve. But I find myself really wanting to do more with SVGs and animations, kind of things that I'm just way behind on, and I want to play with that. But things like the browser APIs, whether that's things for offline or for improving performance, and particularly at the moment, the way that font loading seems to be getting more and more accessible, so that we can start to really create things that visually are very rich and kind of closer to what we might want to make with typography. I'm a bit of a nerd for that stuff. I like that kind of stuff, so I want to play more and more with that.
So Phil, talking about Jamstack Conf in London. Can you maybe also explain in a few words, like what is it going to be about? What's the focus and who is it for? And what is your role there? Are you just, behind the scenes, taking care of the content and all? What's your role there?
Well, so I've had the fun part of the job. So I've had the opportunity to go out and find speakers and find interesting content. So I'm really excited about how the programs come together. We've got people like Chris Coyer who's going to talk about empowering front end developers and how much we can do with front end technologies now based on this kind of Jamstack model. We've got people like Jake Archibald and Surma from Google, from the Google Chrome team, who are going to talk about things like performance in the front end and ways that we can really drive very performant experiences, either with like static hosting or infrastructure or code that runs right in the browser. We're also going to have Una Kravitz talking about things to do with CSS and Houdini and all of those kind of things, and much, much more besides. We'll also be talking about things to do with the kind of cultural change that a Jamstack model can have on your organization and on your projects. So it really reaches all over the place. So I'm kind of excited about that. I'll get the chance also to introduce all of these people because they've let me go wild and be the MC as well. So that means I get to talk to these people and, ask a few questions and those kind of things. So yeah, I think it should be very interesting for anyone who's interested in front-end development and also new models of delivering projects on the web in a really efficient way.
Ah, so you do like the spotlight on stage, huh?
I'm an attention seeker. You should know that by now, Vitaly.
Oh, actually, I always thought that you were very humble and nice and like, kind
It's an
person.
act.
Apparently, I was
It's an
wrong.
act.
Okay, that's fine. Phil, we'll meet like what? In a few... Oh, actually, tomorrow.
I'll see you soon for another event, but otherwise I'll
Yeah.
see you in July, July the 9th and 10th.
And in June on for Smashing Conf Toronto. So, with this in mind, thank you, Phil, and signing off. Bye bye, everyone.
See you soon.